Eliza Miller was a researcher. She usually did standard research at the Miskatonic University in Arkham, but she had her own interests, and her own interests usually went to ghosts and the strange and the unusual. Recently, while looking through some old diaries and journals that had been sent in, she heard of an old mansion in a small coastal town along the shoreline, and deciding that she wanted to investigate it herself, took the journal, booked on a train, and headed to stay there for a few days. When she arrived, the town was smaller than she thought, probably no more than 400 or 500 people. But it had a little hotel, and then high up on the bluff was the large old mansion overlooking the sea. She spent her first couple of days getting to know the town, trying to get to know people and getting them to tell her more about the mansion. But the second the mansion came up, everyone went quiet, backed away, and gave her strange looks. But she wasn't put off. She had her journal, and she could go and visit the mansion herself. She did hear at night, while sitting in the local tavern, people talking about strange sightings, and an old woman who frequently seemed to appear, but when people got close to, vanished. There also supposedly was far more sea mist and fog up there than there had any right to be. The town had a local historian, and being a known researcher, Eliza got access to their archives. The house had actually been there before the town. Built hundreds of years ago, a large family lived in it. I've gained a producer who's curling up with me, sorry. Come over here, say hello. Say hello. My producer. The house had been there for hundreds of years, and a family that was supposedly decadent performed strange rites, and lots of people disappeared, had lived up there till about 50 years ago, when they'd all vanished. Now supposedly anyone that visited the house overnight never returned. This had Eliza's thoughts up, and she decided that the next day she would wander up and visit the house by herself. She took a packed lunch and set off, still carrying the journal that told some of the story of the house. It was a steep climb up the hillside, but she was young and robust, so it was no major problem to her. When she got to the top, it was strange because yes, there seemed to be a mist and light fog falling, and she turned round and could only see the peaks of the houses from the town, but there'd been no fog in the town. She carried on, looking, wondering if she'd see this strange old woman. But no one came. She got closer to the top a young child ran out, asking her where she was going. When she said to the house, he looked horrified and told her she shouldn't go there, it was dangerous. Then disappeared off into the fog. Yet as she looked, there was nowhere for him to run to. He had run towards the bluffs, but not off the end, and just faded into nothing. This started to unnerve her a little, but she was heading, she knew what she was doing, and she headed to the big Gothic house, covered in dark shadows made of dark wood, with heavy iron gates, one hanging slightly off on its side. As she moved onto the gravelled drive, with the heavy crunch, she could still smell the small salt in the sea air. There was the occasional cry of a lone seabird in the distance. But with so little vision, it was a very lonely feeling as it crunched under her feet. The plants to the sides were all long dead and twisted as she made her way towards the large black front doors. Carefully pushing the ancient wood open, there was a dull creak as the door opened and she stepped inside. She'd brought with her a flashlight. She turned it on and the beam extended into the house. It had been deserted before electricity could be added. Onward she went. The shutters were all closed round the outside, so the only light there was the beam from her flashlight. There were holes in some of the floorboards. So she was cautious as she stepped forward. The journal had talked about the owners of the house and their disappearance, and how its original owner was intending to go up and investigate. The house had belonged to a rich family who had then made their money along the shoreline, but then moved away, not wanting to associate with the town where they'd made their money. Despite that, she continued in. There seemed to be a creak behind her and a thunk as the door closed. She looked round, shaken. But there was nothing, there was no one there. Carefully heading back towards the door, again not wanting to break the floor, she tried it, but the door was jammed. She couldn't get the door open. Moving back into the house, she knew now she had to find another way out. She really didn't want to be here after dark, and it had taken her a good half of the day to get up. She moved from room to room where the furniture was still there, covered in large dust sheets. Shutters, heavy-duty shutters, closed, most of them nailed closed, across the windows to prevent the wind or the outside getting in. The house felt sealed. She felt trapped. A strange claustrophobic feeling came on her as she proceeded to head round from room to room, from study to dining room. She headed in to find an impressive library. Her torchlight going up and down the bookshelves, she went carefully looking after the titles, when she thought she heard something behind her. She turned, and there was what appeared to be an aged gentleman there. Hair mostly missing. He looked at her and kind of cocked his head strangely, asking what she'd been there. She replied what she was investigating, and he told her she should leave. As she looked, his feet seemed to be just above the floor. Thinking this strange, she moved towards him, and he nodded and said the house was cursed, and if she didn't leave, she would fall foul and be trapped there forever. Then, just like the boy, seemed to slowly fade away. Panicked now, Eliza moved from room to room, rattling doors, shaking bedrooms. All of the shutters were sealed. She couldn't get them open. She tried smashing things against them and nothing happened. She went running towards the back, thinking that the back door might help, and though it opened, it swung open onto nothing. It ran right to the edge of the cliff face, and all that was the other side of it, as she held the sides of the doorway that she'd used to stop herself, was a long drop into nothing. She stepped back, breathing heavily, and thought she heard children giggling behind her. She turned and could see nothing there, but headed back in, listening to the sound. Carefully walking through. There were footsteps, but they ran toward what appeared to be a wall. The wall was in this strange place in the middle of the house. So she went. As she tapped on it, it sounded hollow, but moving round, she could find no trace of a doorway. No stranger to the idea of secret doors and secret rooms, she began to search carefully, pulling at light fittings, twisting things. When she found nothing, she headed back to the library. There were some books on the history of the family that had owned the house. She pulled one down. It showed how they had not only been merchants, but they had been part of organised crime within the town they were in, making sure that no one else came in that would inflict any issues on their business. Their prime henchman being a man called Larry the Shark, who would kneecap anybody who tried, and if they tried again, he would take them out in his little rowboat, and they would never come back. He would feed them to the sharks. This was horrific as it was, but long in the past. Moving forward, she could see they'd brought the house, and the house was on some kind of burial ground, but they hadn't cared, and they'd built it anyway. And they had been cursed for it, that they would be forever trapped on the site, and that the ghosts would keep them company. She was getting really scared now. She needed out of this house. She needed out of this house now. Time was ticking. She didn't know what time it was, but even the light in the cracks in the shutters seemed to be dimming as though the sun was starting to set. She looked through if there were any other books. Was there anything on the house? Was there anything she could find to get out? Pulling one, she heard a click, and the book wouldn't come. With an idea, she headed back towards the centre of the house where the strange hollow room was. And one of the wooden panels pulled out, separated just a fraction, showing a hidden door. She pulled it open, and heavy stairs headed down. Shining her torch, she looked down, seeing that the light was starting to dim. Her batteries were starting to fail. Carefully, she went down, checking each stair to make sure it could take her weight. One started to give, so she pulled her foot back up, stepped over it, and went down to the next one. Inside the hidden basement was a large room. To one side was a table, and on it was a journal that looked very similar to the one she had. Moving over, she opened the other journal with similar handwriting. The original author had found the house, had come, and had become a victim to its curse. Having been trapped there for a long period of time, they'd done research, looked through the library, trying to find a way out. She pulled the chair back to sit so she could read slightly more easily. Pulling the oil lantern that was on the side, realizing it still had oil, she turned off her flashlight and lit the lantern. As the chair came back, there was a rattle. She looked down, and to her horror, there was a skeleton and bones on the floor. She screamed a little and brought herself under control. Reading through the book, she realised that the house was cursed, and as long as it existed, the curse would hold. Some kind of ritual circle had been made in the centre of the room, with a ritual designed to banish the ghosts. But it had not worked. Thinking fast, she wondered if she could manage to do enough just to enable her to get out. But she was far from sure. As it seemed the sun fell outside, noises increased in the house. She could hear cries, screams, the cries of the agonised, but none seemed to be heading to the basement. For some reason, something kept anything at bay. Hearing a female scream, she turned and headed back up the stairs. Had someone followed her up? She looked, and she saw a ghostly figure that looked very like her, and a large, heavy-set man with a crowbar holding her leg in place. She flinched as the crowbar came down, crashing into the knee, and the young girl screamed. Then the ghostly figure stood, turned, and looked at her, and started walking in her direction. She ran back down the stairs. Her foot crashed through the slightly faded board, and she nearly fell, holding herself and catching herself on the wall, then pulling her now injured leg back out of the hole and hobbling down the rest of the stairs. She looked up, but nothing had followed her. Nothing seemed prepared to enter the graveyard. Stopping and breathing, she wondered why she thought of it as a graveyard. It was a basement. She looked more carefully and could see in the mud of the ground no stone had been laid, and there were slight dips that could only be old graves. Going back to the journal, she read more. All of the family had been buried down here after they became trapped in the house. This was a graveyard, and the ritual circle sat above their graves. Suddenly she thought, maybe the skeletons were something to do with it. She went, knowing a little bit about rituals, she went to look through the book, held her breath and headed back upstairs, running when she got to the top, looking for the figure, heading to the library and slamming the door behind her. She went, seeing if she could find any books on magic. In a small section to one side there was a very thin book, but it was one she recognised from the university. She grabbed the book, flew open the door. The other side, the large figure loomed. Not knowing what to do, she just slammed straight through it as the apparition scattered, coldness grabbing her heart and fear heading down her spine as she burst her way through the ghost and ran for the stairs, crying and screaming. Back down into her horrific little retreat. She got the book on magic and tweaked some of the parts of the ritual circle so that she could actually do something, set the spirits that were buried at rest. But one thing she saw was that the corpses would need to be destroyed. So, moving round, she dug, opening each of the graves, trying not to look at their grisly contents, and went to where the store of oil for the lamp was, and poured oil over each of the graves. Then she lit each of the candles and proceeded with the ritual. After chanting and calling to the spirits and the gods to help her, she could feel powers opening beyond her waking dreams and darkness filling her mind, the tinkle of insanity pulling at the back. She held herself firm and regained her wits. On finishing the ritual, she cast the lantern into the pool of oil, and it split and spread out, filling each of the graves where there was oil. With this, she turned and ran for the stairs, as with little puffs and woofs, the oil went up in the room, rapidly filling it with smoke and fire. Stumbling, going and skipping over, her leg hurting, she could see the spirit at the top of the stairs screaming at her. But she ignored it and turned, taking her journal, not wanting anyone to come, and threw it into the fire. It caught, and the entire room got stronger, and a scream came as the new pages blazed. With it, the large apparition seemed to tremble. She pushed past it, running through the front door, banging and hammering, pulling as hard as she could. But nothing would happen. The flames were now coming up the stairs from the basement. Smoke was filling and she was struggling to breathe. There was only one way to go. She headed back out the back to where she could see the back door, opened it and looked down with the long fall below into the sea. As the flames beat behind her and she could feel herself starting to singe and burn, she made her final prayers and ran, leaping out as far from the house and from the cliff as she could, plummeting into the dark, down, down, till with a jerk she splashed into the sea. The next day, she awoke, confused, looking around as people stood looking at her on the beach. Apparently, in her madness and her delirium, she had managed to get the distance round the cliffs, even in the dark and the water, and just up onto the edge of the beach before collapsing. She'd been found and pulled further up in the morning. And this is what was happening now. Her mind was confused. Her body still had the heat and some burns from the fire. She looked up to the top of the cliff and could only see the ruin of the old house. People came and asked her questions, but she kept quiet, knowing no one would believe her. At night, she had nightmares of being trapped and the ghost still talking to her. The next day, she got the train back to Arkham, determined that from now on, her research would only be in books, not in person, and knowing that for the rest of her life, the events in that house would haunt her both day and night. How was that? I didn't get your zombies in, but I gave you ghosts instead. It's close enough. You had screaming for help from the other room, and I got your kneecapper. I hope you all enjoyed it anyway. Yeah, I'm not going to mention that particular part on YouTube, Tootie. I may not be monetized yet, but I don't want to get demonetized instantly as soon as I am. If anyone wants to see what I'm talking about, bring up the chat when you get the chance. It had to do with a book of family photographs that would be more than a little dubious, shall we say. Well, we seem to have a reasonable number of views for it. We've had 39 across the period, which is pretty good. I think we only got up to 10 or 11 concurrent, so most of them came and went. But that's all good. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I will see you all soon. So, farewell for now. And remember that if you want to search round a haunted house, you may find that the ghosts are searching for you.